because especially the last 2 or 3 weeks have been quite difficult not telling anyone, keeping it to ourselves.
Midnight struck Buckingham Palace with a gravity London had not felt in years. 12 slow, resonant chimes rolled through the stone corridors like a warning carried from another century. Curtains trembled in the draught. Portraits of kings and queens seemed to watch from their gilded frames as though they, too, sensed the shift approaching. Outside the gates, candles flickered in the cold wind, scattered pinpoints of light held by citizens who did not yet know why they were standing there. Only that something in the air felt unbearably different. A hush hung over the palace lawns, the kind that appears only when history is about to turn a page. And then it happened. A communiqué, brief enough to fit in the palm of a hand, was released without ceremony. No trumpet, no balcony, no procession. Just a few carefully chosen lines sent into the night, yet they carried the weight of a crown. Across the kingdom, screens lit up, editors froze mid-sentence. Advisors were summoned in silence. And deep inside Buckingham Palace, in a quiet room warmed only by a sapphire blue fireplace, Prince Louis sat unmoving, his small hands folded, his eyes reflecting a flame that seemed suddenly older than him. The announcement confirmed what only a guarded circle had known. The young prince had been monitored for years, his health studied with the utmost discretion, and now the future mapped for him since birth would need to be rewritten. Roles would shift, traditions would bend, expectations would tremble. But the communiqué did not say why. It did not name the illness. It did not explain the true cause. It left only one haunting question echoing through the kingdom. What could force a royal destiny to be altered in a single night? Before the whispers, before the communiqué sealed in crimson wax, before London's midnight breath turned heavy with foreboding, there was simply a boy whose laughter once echoed through the palace courtyards with a brightness no prophecy could dim. Prince Louis did not enter the world as a symbol. He arrived as every child does, small, curious, unburdened by the myth others would place upon him. In those early years, he became the unexpected spark of joy within a family accustomed to dignity and restraint. Crowds adored him at first sight. His playful expressions during parades, the way he waved with both hands, as if greeting not a kingdom but a playground of familiar faces, these moments became living postcards shared across the world. He was the prince who scrunched his nose, who giggled at planes roaring overhead during national ceremonies, who tugged at his mother's sleeve when the speeches felt too long. The boy behind the balcony did not yet know he was part of history. He simply knew he loved the sound of marching bands, the color of uniforms, the excitement that rippled through London whenever the family stepped out together. But life behind palace walls seldom mirrors the versions glimpsed in photographs. Within the private nursery wing, Louis revealed a softer rhythm, quieter, slower, more inward. While other royal children in generations past were guided early toward public discipline, Louis gravitated toward the hush of the library. He would sit cross-legged on thick, embroidered carpets, surrounded by stories of ancient kingdoms, explorers, and forgotten empires. His tutors often found him tracing the edges of old illustrations with gentle fascination, as though he felt a secret kinship with the past rather than the spotlight of the present. Ceremony, however, is a language the royal family learns young. And though Louis approached it with good-hearted effort, something subtle lingered beneath the surface. After major events, when cameras were gone and uniforms hung neatly back on their racks, he tired more quickly than his siblings. His energy, so bright during moments of play, seemed to drain during long engagements or crowded public appearances. His parents noticed first not with alarm, but with the quiet intuition only family possesses. There were days when he bounced through the palace halls as though he carried a pocket full of summer sunlight, and days when he withdrew into solitude, resting his head against the cool stone window frames overlooking the gardens. The medical team assigned to the royal household observed the same patterns. They kept their notes discreet, their assessments gentle, always prioritizing the boy over the title he carried. They used no alarming words, only phrases like heightened physiological sensitivity and unique developmental responses, the kind that acknowledged a truth without branding it. He was not frail. He was not ill. He was simply different, and difference, in any palace, is both a wonder and a question. Louis himself began noticing the divide between who he was and who the world imagined him to be. During balcony appearances, he felt warmth bloom in his chest as the crowds cheered, but he also felt the strain of standing still under so many watching eyes. He adored the laughter, the spectacle, the music, but afterward he often slipped away to sit alone in the garden, letting the wind cool the overstimulation from his skin. The palace staff grew protective, adjusting schedules quietly so he could rest between lessons, ensuring public outings remained brief and buffered. His siblings, young as they were, learned to sense when he needed a moment away from the noise. They became both playmates and gentle shields, guiding him through traditions he didn't always fit neatly into. Yet, for all the accommodations, one truth hovered unspoken. The destiny tradition expected of him might demand more than his nature could comfortably give. Childhood, for Louis, became a balancing act between the world that saw him as a charming symbol of modern royalty and the hidden world where he existed simply as a thoughtful, introspective boy who preferred stories to ceremonies and warmth to grandeur. He lived in the spotlight, but belonged instinctively to the shade, not a darkness, but a calm, protective quiet where he could simply breathe. No one could have predicted then that these small observations, these gentle adjustments, would one day form the foundation of a decision that would shift the monarchy's path. Childhood was not the tragedy. Childhood was the clue, the whisper of a fate diverging softly from the one carved in silver for him at birth. And as London would one day learn, the boy behind the balcony had never been destined for the center of the stage. He had been destined for something else entirely. Adolescence arrives quietly in most households, a shift in height, a deeper tone of voice, a new seriousness settling into a child's gaze. But in Buckingham Palace, adolescence does not slip in unnoticed. It is scheduled, prepared for, and documented. It is monitored by tutors, anticipated by advisors, and shaped by the long shadow of centuries-old expectation. For Prince Louis, this transition began with a new timetable: diplomacy, primers, etiquette sessions, light ceremonial rehearsals, guided introductions to constitutional history. Nothing demanding, nothing heavy. These were the earliest steps toward a life that tradition insisted every royal child must at least be ready to shoulder. Louis approached these lessons the way he approached most things, with sincerity, curiosity, and a quiet determination that belied his age. His tutors often left sessions impressed by how quickly he absorbed abstract concepts, how instinctively he grasped the emotional undercurrents behind diplomacy, how deeply he listened when others spoke. "Sharp mind," one advisor wrote in a private note. "Deeply intuitive," another added. But beneath the praise lay an unspoken truth. The prince's tolerance for prolonged public-facing duties remained significantly lower than expected. The first hints emerged during mock engagements. Louis would enter the room composed, attentive, offering a polite nod or carefully practiced greeting. Yet as the minutes passed, as conversations deepened, as multiple voices layered over one another, a subtle exhaustion settled on his face. After each session, he needed longer breaks than planned. His concentration faded not from disinterest, but from a sensory tide rising too quickly. Doctors, still cautious and discreet, reviewed their notes from previous years. Patterns resurfaced. His heightened sensitivity to noise crowds extended formality. Nothing alarming, just a boy whose wiring responded differently from those before him. They recommended reducing intensity, spacing out sessions, ensuring adequate recovery time. But tradition, even softened by modernity, resists bending. Every child must be prepared equally. Some senior courtiers reminded, duty cannot rely on flexibility. Others insisted. Thus began the first fracture, thin, nearly invisible, but real, between heritage and humanity. Louis tried his best to bridge that gap. He perfected the diplomatic greetings. He memorized historical lineages with poetic fluency. He learned the rhythm of formal dinners, the choreography of walking beside officials, the measured cadence expected of a young prince. But the toll revealed itself slowly, like a tide washing further ashore each week. After long lessons, he would retreat to the garden with a book pressed to his chest, letting the cool air restore what the day had taken. On training days that involved simulated ceremonies, he sometimes asked his tutors for one quiet minute before they began again, a simple request, but one that spoke volumes. It was not unwillingness. It was not rebellion. It was limitation wrapped in earnest effort. His advisors admired his resilience. They also worried. A prince does not need to be invincible, but he does need to endure certain public burdens, and endurance was precisely the trait Louis struggled to manifest in the traditional sense. One autumn afternoon, during a rehearsal for a future state walkabout, the truth showed itself more clearly. Louis completed the exercise, smiling politely, offering soft-spoken greetings to staff acting as citizens. But the moment the session ended, he exhaled a long, trembling breath, shoulders falling as though he had carried a weight twice his size. His physician approached the senior household committee soon after. He has the intellect, the doctor said gently. He has the empathy. But sustained ceremonial exposure, it drains him. Significantly, we must consider a different path of preparation, and I5 or 6 and other of now. A different path. Two words that echoed through the palace like a distant bell. Some embraced the suggestion quietly, cautiously seeing in Louis not a flaw, but a new kind of prince. Others resisted politely, firmly fearing that deviation from tradition would signal weakness to the world. The debate did not erupt. It simmered, a tension polite enough to be hidden, powerful enough to reshape everything that followed. Louis sensed it in the way adults paused when speaking about his future. He sensed it in whispered conversations that ended abruptly when he entered a room. He sensed it in the slightly too bright encouragements, the ones meant to reassure him, but which only made him wonder what reassurance was needed for. Still, he did not falter. He pushed forward, attending each training, offering each lesson his full attention. He gave everything he had, because effort was something he could control. Destiny, less so. The rise of Prince Louis was not forged in triumphs or achievements. It was forged in pressure, quiet, persistent, and unrelenting. Pressure to endure what others had endured. Pressure to embody a legacy built for a different kind of child, in a different kind of century. Pressure to become someone the world expected, rather than someone he naturally was. And yet, somewhere beneath that growing weight was a truth waiting to surface. Sometimes a rising tide does not lift a person upward, it pushes them sideways, toward a shore no one saw coming. Rise, for Louis, was not ascent. It was the slow, inevitable revelation that he had been climbing a staircase never meant for his feet. By the time Prince Louis stepped into his preteen years, the world had already claimed him as one of its favorite small wonders of modern royalty. His appearances rare, brief, often unscripted, carried a charm that cut through the formality of public ceremony. A single wave, a mischief-filled grin, a whispered joke to his siblings on the balcony could eclipse the stiffness of state protocol and send social media spinning with affection. He had a gift, an innocence that softened the grandeur around him, a spontaneity that made centuries of monarchy feel unexpectedly human. Whenever he appeared, cameras brightened, crowds leaned forward, and headlines blossomed with warmth. But fame, even gentle fame, has its shadows. Every appearance that delighted the public came at a hidden cost. What the world saw was a boy waving enthusiastically during a parade. What the palace saw was the aftermath, a slow walk back to the private wing. Shoulders heavy, cheeks drained, a silence settling over him like a thin veil. After large events, it sometimes took hours for Louis to recover his usual spark, sometimes days. The palace medical team kept meticulous notes, their observations always phrased with caution: extended overstimulation, post-engagement fatigue, delayed recovery window, in re% avaisements. Nothing alarming, but undeniably real, and undeniably incompatible with the traditional trajectory expected of a young prince. The palace staff began quietly adjusting protocols, appearances became shorter, schedules became lighter. Public placements were arranged with precision so that his siblings Princess Charlotte and Prince George naturally stepped forward to take on the more demanding moments. Charlotte, graceful and instinctively attuned to her brother, often shifted closer during walkabouts, picking up conversations before Louis felt overwhelmed. George, earnest and protective, learned to guide their trio's pace, positioning himself between Louis and crowds without drawing attention to the gesture. To the public, these simply looked like sweet sibling dynamics. Inside Buckingham, they were subtle acts of guardianship. But palace life is a machine powered by tradition, and tradition does not easily accept quiet rearrangements. As Louis's pattern became clearer, conversations began behind heavy oak doors, not whispered gossip, but structured meetings conducted with the solemnity of constitutional affairs. In the legal council wing, advisors debated precedent. Had a young royal's duties ever been adapted in this way before? What language could be used without triggering constitutional alarm? In the Privy Council chamber, members reviewed historical cases where roles had been altered due to health, personality, or political need. Most examples were archaic, rooted in eras where silence, not transparency, had been the monarchy's shield. The doctors, though discreet, were firm in their recommendations. Louis was capable, intelligent, emotionally mature, but his physiology responded differently to prolonged attention. Ceremonial stress, sensory overload. Pushing him toward a traditional path could jeopardize his long-term well-being. Then came the cultural ministers, who framed the dilemma not as a crisis but as an evolution. Perhaps the definition of service must expand. Perhaps duty can look different for different heirs. End quote. They spoke of a third path, a way to preserve the dignity of tradition while honoring the humanity of a child who had never chosen fame but was born into it nonetheless. Still, The discussions were delicate. Any adjustment to royal expectation inevitably touched the entire nation. The world watched the prince with adoration. They saw the joy he brought, the life he breathed into formal ceremonies. They did not see the quiet moments afterward, the subtle toll of that spotlight. To the outside, fame was a constellation of charming clips and heartwarming gestures. Inside the palace, fame was a mirror reflecting his vulnerability more starkly than anyone wished to admit. Yet Louis never broke, not under the pressure of being watched, not under the weight of expectation. He adapted in his own quiet way, finding balance in solitude, grounding himself in books, gardens, and the small rituals of daily life. He learned how to endure without pretending to be someone he wasn't, how to give the world a moment of joy without sacrificing himself to it. But those tasked with protecting him knew the truth. The moment would come when the palace would have to speak. Not with evasions, not with tradition's usual silence, but with honesty, because the weight of expectation was no longer sustainable. Fame, in Louis' story, was never the shimmering arc of triumph the world associates with monarchy. It was the unintentional spotlight that illuminated a fault line running through the entire institution, a fault line between what had always been done and what must now be reconsidered. And as the palace prepared for the inevitable reckoning, one realization settled over Buckingham like gathering storm clouds. The prince did not shatter beneath fame, but the system built around him might have to. The night the communiqué was released, Buckingham Palace seemed to inhale and never quite exhale. Even the air felt suspended, as if waiting for something it did not know how to name. Outside, the Union flag rose only halfway up the mast, not signaling death, but signaling the end of an expectation, a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter long assumed had gently, irrevocably closed. London understood the symbolism instantly. Buckingham understood it even more. Yet the tragedy unfolding within those ancient walls was not one of loss in the traditional sense. No life ended. No catastrophe struck. Instead, something subtler and, in its own way, far more human fell apart. The belief that every prince born into the House of Windsor must follow the same carved path toward public duty and ceremonial inheritance. The palace did not weep that night. No one raised their voice. But silence itself became an emotion, a thick, heavy presence that filled corridors and clung to velvet drapery like mist. It was a silence of recognition, a silence of surrender, a silence of love struggling to coexist with legacy. Deep within the palace, in a room warmed by the steady flicker of a sapphire blue hearth, Prince Louis sat in an oversized armchair, his legs curled under him, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in patterns older than memory. Advisors stood nearby, hands clasped, voices softened to whispers though no one was speaking. The communiqué had gone out only minutes earlier. The world now knew what the family had long been bracing for. And yet Louis, despite his age, understood more than anyone expected. Children who grow up surrounded by expectation feel tension even when it isn't spoken. They sense shifts before they are explained. That night, Louis sensed everything. He turned toward his father, not the monarch, but the man behind the crown, and asked the question every soul in the room feared he might reach for. Will history forget me if I'm not in the light? The words fell with the weight of ancient prophecy. No minister, no counselor, no doctor had prepared an answer for that. For the first time in the long reign of his calm public composure, the king's expression faltered. His breath caught, his eyes lowered. He was not king in that moment. He was father one, forced to choose between the child he loved and the tradition that had shaped his very identity. He could feel the eyes of his forebears upon him, the portraits lining the grand gallery, the lineage tracing back centuries, kings molded by duty, queens strengthened by sacrifice, monarchs who bore burdens in silence. But this was different. This was a child asking if stepping away from the center meant disappearing altogether. Before the king could answer, the chief counselor softly intervened, not to silence the question but to honor it. "Your Highness," she whispered, kneeling slightly so her eyes matched his. "History remembers many kinds of light. Not all of them shine from balconies." End quote. Louis listened, but the doubt in his eyes did not fade. Meanwhile, in the council chamber one floor below, senior advisors were finalizing the resolution that would alter the course of his life. Documents lay spread across a mahogany table polished by centuries of decisions. The royal physician's reports were stacked on one side, constitutional briefs on the other. The verdict was unanimous, not out of strategy, but out of necessity and compassion. Nearly all future public duties would be withdrawn. Succession training would be halted indefinitely. A new role tailored, protected, purposeful, would be crafted for him. This was not punishment, nor failure. It was mercy wrapped in heartbreak. Upstairs, the king felt the decision before he heard the official words. The weight pressed onto his shoulders the way crowns do, heavy, unrelenting, symbolic. He knew what it meant. He knew what history expected. But he also knew his son, the boy who loved books more than ceremonies, who grew weary beneath the world's gaze, whose laughter was a gift too rare to risk extinguishing. So when the advisors entered to confirm the final decision, the king simply nodded. Not as ruler, as father. Tragedy came not from illness, but from clarity, the realization that the traditional road ahead, the one paved with protocol and expectation, was not a road his son could travel without cost. A destiny, once assumed fixed, had shifted. Not shattered but reshaped. Not by scandal but by truth. Downstairs, the palace clock struck a muted hour, and somewhere in the city, a journalist wrote the first line of tomorrow's headline, unaware of the quiet storm of love and sorrow unfolding behind Buckingham's sealed doors. That night, the tragedy was not the end of a future. It was the end of a version of that future one the world expected, but one Louis could not inhabit without losing himself. A destiny had changed. And for the first time in centuries, the monarchy would have to change with it. The truth that reshaped the monarchy did not arrive through diagnosis or dramatic revelation. It arrived quietly, almost shyly, the way certain truths do when they have been present all along, waiting for others to notice. For years, advisors, tutors, and family members had admired Prince Louis's unusual gift without fully understanding its significance. They noticed how he slowed his steps in the palace library, how he touched the spines of ancient books with reverent care, how he traced the edges of illuminated manuscripts as though deciphering secrets no one else could see. He absorbed stories not the way most children do as entertainment, but as inheritance. Not the inheritance of crowns, but of memory, of lineage, of meaning. He belonged not to the roar of balcony cheers, but to the whisper of pages turned under warm lamplight. And so, when the palace finally stepped back and allowed itself to see Louis clearly, the hidden truth revealed itself. The boy was never meant for the throne. He was meant for the story of the throne. This realization struck certain advisors with unexpected clarity. One archivist remembered how Louis, at only 7, had asked whether worn book covers made the stories inside tired too, a question no historian could forget. Another recalled how he instinctively aligned disordered documents into chronological sequence without guidance. A conservationist noted how he handled fragile textiles with the intuition of someone who understood that age was not damage, but dignity. These were not the skills of a sovereign. They were the instincts of a custodian of history. Thus, while the world mourned what Louis would not become, the palace began to glimpse what he could become: something new, something true, something meaningful in a way the crown had not defined before. And so the king summoned a small gathering deep within the archival wing, a part of Buckingham Palace most visitors never see, a cathedral of quiet knowledge. The room was lit by soft pools of lamplight falling across rows of ancient manuscripts, gilded records, and the preserved whispers of centuries. No cameras were allowed. No journalists waited outside. This would not be a public ceremony. This was a reconsecration of identity, private, sacred, unrecorded. Louis entered wearing simple, tailored garments, nothing ceremonial. His siblings stood beside him, their presence gentle and unwavering. The archivists and curators, guardians of the kingdom's memory, gathered in a semicircle, their expressions respectful, almost tender. The king stepped forward, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. For a moment he did not speak. He simply looked at Louis the way fathers do when pride and heartbreak share the same breath. Then, in a voice softened by the weight of lineage and love, he said, "Some serve under the crown. Others serve by preserving its story." End quote. The words settled into the room like dust motes, catching light, delicate, undeniable, transforming everything they touched. Louis blinked slowly, absorbing their meaning. For the first time since the communiqué had shattered the world's assumptions, his shoulders eased. A small, hesitant warmth flickered across his expression, as if he were recognizing himself in a way he never had before. The king continued, speaking not as monarch but as father. "You were not made to carry the weight of public expectation. You were made to carry memory. And memory, my son, is its own kind of power. Doct of the Bade. Doct of the 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 Bade." The archivist stepped forward then, showing him ancient manuscripts, their ink faded, their edges crumbling, and explained that these fragile objects shaped the monarchy more profoundly than any procession or balcony appearance. They showed him tapestries that depicted royal triumphs and failures alike. They showed him letters written by monarchs long gone, full of doubts, fears, and private hopes. They showed him artifacts that survived fire, war, and time, reminders that history is both delicate and resilient. Louis listened the way he always did, fully present, deeply moved. And in that hushed, sacred room, something shifted inside him. He no longer felt like a prince being pushed out of destiny. He felt like a guardian being welcomed into purpose. A purpose without applause. A purpose without spectacle. A purpose that did not demand he become someone he wasn't. The hidden truth was not that Louis lacked something required for kingship. The hidden truth was that he possessed something rare, a capacity to carry the kingdom's soul rather than its ceremonies. Not every legacy shines in gold. Some are written in ink that survives centuries. Some are threaded into fabric worn thin by time. Some are whispered into the ears of future generations through preservation, stewardship, and quiet devotion. And so the palace realized what the world soon would. Stepping out of the spotlight was not Louis's downfall. It was his alignment with destiny. A new path had opened, one far from the balcony, but closer to the heart of the monarchy than anyone had expected. For history is not only shaped by those who rule, it is shaped just as deeply by those who protect its memory, even from rooms where no one is watching. Spring returned to London with a gentleness the kingdom seemed to need. Blossoms opened along the palace gardens. Sunlight slipped through the high windows of Buckingham, and the final official statement was released measured, dignified, serene. Prince Louis would not continue the traditional path of succession. He would instead serve as a steward of cultural heritage, a guardian of the stories that shaped the crown rather than the crown itself. Across the nation, the response was not sorrow. It was reverence. Letters arrived tied with lavender ribbons. Children sent watercolor drawings of old books and royal crests. Adults wrote not of pity, but of pride, thanking the young prince for reminding them that purpose can be quiet and still powerful. And one morning, before the palace fully woke, Louis stepped into the archive hall for the first day of his new life. Dust motes drifted like tiny constellations as he opened a 400-year-old manuscript with white-gloved hands. The ink, though faded, still breathed. The past welcomed him home. Here, among whispered histories and fragile pages, he understood a deeper truth. Some destinies are written in gold upon banners. Others are written between lines, and both shape history. If this journey moved you, share your thoughts below. Where does true strength come from the spotlight, or the quiet depth of one's calling? And if you wish to walk beside us through more cinematic royal journeys, feel free to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes destiny can take many forms.